Ladies and gentlemen, when someone hurts you deeply, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the mind. The experience does not stay in the moment where it occurred. It begins to echo. It replays in memory, in imagination, in the quiet spaces where you are alone with your thoughts. And if you are not careful, that pain slowly shifts from being an experience you went through to something you begin to believe about yourself. This is where many people lose their footing without even realizing it. They start to confuse what happened to them with who they are. A person's rejection becomes "I am unlovable." A betrayal becomes "I cannot trust anyone." Emotional neglect becomes "I am not important." Over time, these conclusions feel less like thoughts and more like truths. But they are not truths. They are interpretations formed in pain, and pain is never a reliable philosopher. Psychologically, this is how emotional injury reshapes identity. The mind is always trying to make sense of suffering. It wants explanations, even if those explanations are harmful. So when love turns painful, the mind does not immediately question the other person's capacity to love or their emotion. Instead, it often turns inward. It assumes responsibility for what it could not control. It asks, "What is wrong with me?" rather than what was missing in them. And in that shift, self-worth begins to erode quietly, almost invisibly. But there is something important to understand here. Being hurt does not define your value, it reveals someone else's limitation. A person can fail you emotionally and still have nothing to do with your worth. Their inability to love with consistency, respect, or depth is not a measurement of your desirability as a human being. It is a reflection of their inner capacity, their emotional maturity, and often their own unresolved wounds. Yet, when you are in the middle of pain, clarity becomes difficult. The emotional system is louder than logic. That is why people who are deeply hurt often start reshaping themselves just to avoid further rejection. They overthink every detail of their behavior. They become smaller, quieter, more agreeable. They try to become easier to love, not realizing that love which requires self-erasure is not love at all. It is performance under pressure. And so the identity begins to fracture. On the outside, life, end. May continue, but internally there is a slow collapse of self-trust. You begin to doubt your judgment, your attractiveness, your emotional intelligence, even your right to expect respect. That is what repeated emotional pain does when it is not understood. It does not just break the heart, it distorts the lens through which you see yourself. But let's bring this back to something grounded and clear. You are not defined by how someone treated you when they were disconnected from their own integrity. You are defined by your capacity to recognize truth, to grow through experience, and to refuse permanent residence in temporary pain. What happened to you may have shaped a chapter of your life, but it is not allowed to author your identity unless you surrender that authority. There is a moment in every person's healing where a quiet realization begins to form. What if the story I have been telling myself is not actually true? That question is the beginning of freedom. Because once you question the interpretation, you begin to loosen its grip. And once the grip loosens, you begin to see yourself again, not through the eyes of someone who hurt you, but through the reality of who you are. You are not the rejection. You are not the betrayal. You are not the moment someone failed to value you. Those are experiences, not definitions. And there is a profound difference between the two. When you begin to separate identity from injury, something stabilizes inside you. You stop reacting to life from a place of emotional damage and start responding from a place of clarity. You stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and start asking, "Why did I accept less than I deserve?" That shift alone marks the beginning of emotional maturity. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to understand that your worth was never something someone else had the power to assign or remove. It was never sitting in their approval, their attention, or their validation. It was always internal, intact, and untouched by their choices. So the first step in handling a man who hurts you is not revenge, not explanation, and not even immediate confrontation. It is recognition. The recognition that your value did not change when someone failed to honor it. It only felt like it changed because pain temporarily clouded your perception. And once that clarity returns, you no longer see yourself as someone trying to recover worth. You see yourself as someone who never lost it in the first place. Because the truth is simple, even if it takes time to fully believe. What hurt you may have shaken your emotions, but it never had the authority to define your soul. One of the most difficult emotional traps a person can fall into is not just the pain of being hurt, but the ongoing need to return to the source of that pain for relief. It sounds contradictory, but psychologically it is very common. After someone has wounded you, especially someone you were emotionally invested in, there remains a quiet internal pull to go back and seek something from them. Understanding, acknowledgement, apology, or even just a sense of closure. But here is the hard truth that many people resist accepting. You cannot receive healing from the same place that created your wound. And yet, people try repeatedly. They replay conversations in their mind, they send messages they know they should not send, they check for signs of change. They wait for a version of the person that may never exist. This is not love anymore. It becomes emotional dependency disguised as hope. At the core of this behavior is aversion. By human fear, the fear of abandonment. The mind often prefers painful attachment over uncertain detachment. Because detachment feels like emptiness at first. It feels like losing control, like stepping into silence where answers are no longer guaranteed. So instead of facing that discomfort, a person clings to familiarity, even if that familiarity is the very thing causing the damage. But what you must understand is this: validation has a dangerous side when it is placed in the wrong hands. If the same person who broke your emotional safety becomes the one you depend on to restore your self-worth, then your healing is no longer in your control. It becomes conditional. It depends on their mood, their awareness, their willingness, or their guilt. And that is not stability, that is emotional captivity. When someone has hurt you, your mind often starts negotiating with reality. It says, maybe if I explain it better, they will understand. Or maybe if I change something about myself, they will treat me differently. This creates a cycle where you slowly begin to abandon yourself in order to preserve a connection that is already damaging you. And the tragedy is that the more you abandon, and yourself, the less respect you receive from the other person, because people rarely value what is constantly available at the expense of self-respect. This is where emotional independence becomes not just helpful, but essential. Emotional independence is the ability to recognize that your worth does not require external approval to exist. It is the inner stability that says, I can miss someone, I can feel pain, I can even love them, but I will not lose myself in the process. That kind of strength does not come from suppression. It comes from awareness. You begin to observe your own emotional patterns without obeying every impulse they create. You start noticing that the urge to reach out is often not coming from clarity, but from discomfort. And discomfort is not always a signal to act. Sometimes it is a signal to endure and grow. There is also a deeper psychological shift that must happen here. You must begin to separate your identity from your access to that person. Just because someone no longer provides attention, affection, or reassurance does not mean you have lost value. It simply means the dynamic is no longer serving your emotional well-being. But if your sense of worth is tied to their response, then every silence becomes a form of punishment, and every delay becomes a source of anxiety. This is why people remain stuck for so long. Not because they lack intelligence or strength, but because they are still emotionally negotiating with someone who has already stopped negotiating back. And in that imbalance, self-respect slowly erodes. At some point, you have to ask yourself a difficult but necessary question. What am I actually chasing? Am I chasing love, or am I chasing relief from discomfort? Because those two things are not always the same. Love does not require you to repeatedly question your value. Real connection does not force you to compete for basic emotional consistency. And when you finally begin to withdraw your need for validation from the person who hurt you, something significant happens internally. The emotional noise begins to settle. At first there is withdrawal because your mind is adjusting to the absence of a familiar pattern. But underneath that discomfort, something more stable begins to form. Self-trust. Self-trust is the foundation of emotional freedom. It is the quiet confidence that says, even if I am not chosen, I see. And even if I am not understood, even if I am not validated in this moment, I still remain whole. That is the point where you stop outsourcing your worth and start reclaiming your inner authority. You begin to realize that closure is not something they give you. It is something you decide to stop waiting for. Because waiting for closure from someone who hurt you is often just another form of staying emotionally attached to the pain. And once you release that need, your perspective shifts. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to be chosen. You see yourself as someone deciding what is acceptable in your life. That shift moves you from emotional dependency into emotional leadership. So the second step in handling a man who hurts you is not confrontation and not persuasion. It is withdrawal of permission. You withdraw permission for their behavior to define your emotional state. You withdraw permission for their silence to dictate your self-worth. You withdraw permission for your healing to depend on their participation. Because the moment you stop seeking validation from the source of your pain, you stop feeding the cycle that keeps you stuck in it. And that is where freedom begins, not when they finally change, but when you finally stop waiting for them to. There comes a point in emotional suffering where words are no longer enough. You can explain yourself, defend yourself, even try to reason your way into being understood, and still find that nothing changes. And in those moments, many people assume the solution must be to try harder, to speak more clearly, to give more explanations, to prove more love, to tolerate more pain. But in reality, there is a deeper truth that often gets overlooked. Not every situation is healed by engagement. Some situations are healed by withdrawal. Silence, boundaries, and emotional detachment are often misunderstood. People confuse them with coldness, pride, or indifference. But psychologically and spiritually, they are none of those things. They are forms of self-respect in action. They are the quiet decision that says, I will no longer participate in what consistently diminishes me. When someone has hurt you repeatedly, there is a tendency to stay in the cycle of explanation. You try to make them see your perspective, to help them understand your emotional experience, to guide them into awareness of their impact. But this is where a critical misunderstanding often occurs. Awareness does not always produce change. A person can fully understand your pain and still not have the capacity or willingness to treat you differently. And when understanding is present without transformation, continuing to engage often becomes self-inflicted harm. So at some point, wisdom has to replace emotional reaction. You stop asking, how can I make them see my value? And you start asking, why am I still trying to prove my value to someone who consistently overlooks it? That shift in questioning is the beginning of boundaries. Boundaries are not about controlling another person. They are about defining the conditions under which you will remain emotionally available. And when those conditions are repeatedly violated, the most honest boundary is distance. Not punishment, not revenge. Distance. But distance is uncomfortable at first, especially when emotional attachment is strong. The mind will try to interpret it as loss, as abandonment, as failure. Yet what is actually happening is far more significant. You are interrupting a pattern that has kept you emotionally unstable, and anything that interferes, a long-standing emotional pattern, will initially feel like disruption, even if it is healing. Detachment, in its truest form, is not emotional numbness. It is emotional clarity. It is the ability to see a situation for what it consistently produces, not what you hope it could become. Many people stay attached not to reality, but to potential. They are not responding to what is happening, they are responding to what they wish would happen. And that gap between reality and expectation is where most emotional suffering lies. When you begin to detach, you start to notice something important. Your emotional state becomes less reactive. You are no longer constantly adjusting your mood based on someone else's behavior. You are no longer interpreting every message, every silence, every inconsistency as a reflection of your worth. Instead, you begin to observe patterns objectively, and patterns, when seen clearly, rarely lie. There is also a deeper psychological strength that emerges through detachment, emotional containment. This is the ability to hold your feelings without allowing them to dictate your decisions. You can acknowledge pain without being controlled by it. You can feel love without surrendering your boundaries. You can experience disappointment without abandoning yourself. That level of internal stability is what separates emotional survival from emotional maturity. And here is something that must be understood clearly. Enduring pain is not the same as being strong. Many people confuse tolerance with strength. They believe that staying, no matter how inconsistent or harmful the situation becomes, is a form of loyalty or resilience. But real strength is not measured by how much you can endure. It is measured by how clearly you can recognize when endurance is costing you your peace. There is also a moral misunderstanding that keeps people trapped. They believe that walking away from someone who hurts them is unkind or disloyal. But staying in a dynamic where your emotional needs are consistently dismissed is not loyalty, it is self-abandonment. And self-abandonment, repeated over time, does not create love. It creates exhaustion, resentment, and emotional fragmentation. So silence becomes necessary not because you have nothing to say, but because your words are no longer being honored. Boundaries become necessary not because you want to punish someone, but because you are finally willing to protect what remains of your emotional stability. And detachment becomes necessary not because you do not care, but because caring without self-respect leads to internal destruction. There is a moment in every person's healing where they realize that continuing to engage in the same emotional pattern is no longer a sign of hope, it is a sign of self-neglect. And that realization changes everything. Because once you see it clearly, you can no longer pretend that tolerance is the same as love. At that point, your behavior shifts. You no longer chase clarity from confusion. You no longer argue for basic respect. You no longer stay where your presence requires emotional compromise. Instead, you begin to choose peace even when it feels unfamiliar. And that choice, repeated consistently, rebuilds your inner foundation. So the third step in handling a man who hurts you is not confrontation, not explanation, and not explanation, and not emotional escalation. It is disciplined withdrawal. The quiet, steady decision to step out of what repeatedly breaks you without hatred, without drama, but with unwavering clarity. Because the truth is simple, you do not heal by staying in what wounds you. You heal by removing yourself from the conditions that keep reopening the injury. And in that removal, something powerful happens. You begin to return to yourself. When people think about revenge, they usually think in terms of getting even, proving a point, or making someone feel the pain they caused. But that entire framework keeps you emotionally tied to the very experience you are trying to escape. Because revenge, in its emotional form, still requires the other person to remain central in your internal world. It still gives them influence. It still lets them occupy space in your thoughts, your reactions, and your identity. But there is a far deeper and more powerful form of resolution, one that does not require retaliation, explanation, or even confrontation. It is the quiet transformation where your life becomes the evidence that pain did not defeat you. This is where healing stops being an idea and becomes a lived reality. The truth is, when someone hurts you deeply, the most dangerous place you can stay is not in their presence, it is in the emotional version of yourself that the experience creates. That version is often smaller, more cautious, more doubtful, more guarded. And if you are not intentional, you begin to live from that version long after the situation has ended. You carry the injury forward as if it is still active. But healing begins the moment you decide that the person who hurt you does not get to define the person you become next. Psychologically, this is a shift from external validation to internal reconstruction. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" you begin to ask, "Who am I becoming because of this?" That question changes the direction of your life. Because suffering, when left unconscious, turns into bitterness. But suffering, when processed with awareness, turns into wisdom. Forgiveness plays a crucial role here, but not in the way people often misunderstand it. Forgiveness is not approval. It is not reconciliation, and it is not forgetting. True forgiveness is release. It is the decision to stop allowing the emotional weight of what happened to continue shaping your present reality. It is the moment you stop rehearsing resentment in your mind, not because the action was acceptable, but because your peace is more important than ongoing internal conflict. But forgiveness alone is enough if it is not followed by rebuilding. Because emotional wounds do not heal through time alone, they heal through intentional restoration of identity. You begin to reconnect with parts of yourself that were diminished during the experience. Your confidence, your clarity, your sense of direction, your ability to trust your own judgment. These are not automatically restored, they are rebuilt through conscious effort. And something important begins to happen during this process. You start to realize that the pain you thought was purely destructive also contained information. It revealed what you will no longer tolerate. It exposed where your boundaries were weak. It clarified what emotional safety means to you. In that sense, the experience becomes not just something you survived, but something you learned from. This is where emotional maturity begins to take shape. You stop asking life to erase what happened, and instead start using what happened to refine your standards. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop confusing intensity with love. You stop accepting emotional confusion as connection. And in doing, fire. So your entire relational world begins to shift. At the same time, there is a quiet but powerful reawakening of purpose. Because when emotional pain is no longer consuming all of your attention, energy begins to return to areas of your life that were previously neglected. Your goals, your growth, your creativity, your spiritual grounding, your personal development, all of it starts to come back into focus. And this is where transformation becomes visible, not just internal. And without needing to announce it, without needing to prove it, your life begins to reflect a different state of being. You are calmer where you were once reactive. You are grounded where you were once anxious. You are self-directed where you were once dependent on emotional approval. This is not performance. It is reconstruction. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: the person who hurt you no longer has authority over your future. Not because they changed, not because they apologized, but because you stopped building your life around their impact. That is where freedom truly begins, not in what they do next, but in what you choose next. So the deepest form of revenge, if it can even be called that, is not destruction. It is elevation. It is becoming so grounded in your own growth, so aligned with your own peace, that the pain becomes irrelevant to your direction. You do not erase the past, but you outgrow its control over you. And in that state, something profound happens. You are no longer living as someone who was hurt. You are living as someone who was rebuilt. And that is the final turning point. When your healing becomes louder than your history, and your peace becomes stronger than your past.